They say grief dulls everything except memory. But when I stood in the front row of the rain-dark funeral, watching the sea mist cling to the black umbrellas around me, it was anger, not memory, that clung hardest. I hadn't seen my godmother, Evelyn Ward, in over 3 years, not since she stopped returning my calls. She'd always been more than an aunt figure. She was my confessor, my childhood escape hatch, my compass when my mother vanished into prescription bottles and broken promises. And now she was ash in an urn, and her secrets, it seemed, had followed her into the ground. If you're drawn into this story of inheritance, buried secrets, and a woman forced to confront what her family left behind, like, subscribe and follow for more long-form stories of betrayal and reinvention. After the service, the lawyer approached me with a box. It was oak, hand-carved, with the kind of intricate detail that demanded patience and quiet hands. Inside was a letter, sealed in crimson wax, and a key. The letter was written in Evelyn's unmistakable looping script. "Dearest Elena, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're about to curse my name. I've left you Seaworn Books. The terms are simple. Run it for 6 months, no interruptions. If you leave early, the entire estate, store, property, and the house behind it passes to the alternate beneficiary. No loopholes. No exceptions. Trust me, staying is harder. But it's also necessary." I should have walked away then. I was still bruised from the divorce, half living out of a sublet in Brooklyn, freelancing to pay off my lawyer's final invoice. I didn't need some creaking bookstore by the ocean or whatever sentimental anchor Evelyn had wrapped in posthumous obligation. But then I looked around the cemetery, at the strangers who'd shown up in dark coats and stiff expressions, and something in me sparked. There was no one else. No friends. No photos. Just silence and a will. The next morning, I arrived in West Haven. It was a coastal town caught between charm and erosion. The kind of place where the paint peeled perfectly and the locals never forgot who belonged. Evelyn's bookstore sat at the end of an old cobbled lane, wedged between an antique shop and a shuttered cafe. Its faded sign, "Seaworn Books," hung crooked on rusted chains. The windows were fogged, and the key fit like it hadn't been turned in weeks. Inside, the smell of old paper and damp would hit me like memory. Dust floated in shafts of light that cut through cracked glass. Everything was exactly as I remembered, and completely unfamiliar. The counter was cluttered with unopened mail. A broken lamp leaned behind the register, and on the wall near the back, hung crooked under a warped photograph of Evelyn in her 20s, was a framed quote, "The truth is always one locked door away." It didn't feel like a bookstore. It felt like a message. And something told me I wasn't the only one who had received one. The first full day inside Seaworn Books felt like moving into a stranger's memory. Evelyn had labeled nothing, organized everything by instinct, and left behind no notes, at least not where most people would look. The front counter was an archaeological dig of receipts, dead pens, and unopened letters. I found the utilities still running, the Wi-Fi disconnected, and a tiny space heater humming in the back office, like a holdover from another decade. It was early September, but the wind off the sea had already begun its slow bite. I wrapped my scarf tighter and began sorting through the stacks. That's when I found the ledger. It was tucked behind a loose panel beneath the front counter, not locked but hidden. The cover was simple, black cloth bound with gold corners. Old-fashioned in a way that felt deliberate. Inside, I expected sales records, vendor receipts, maybe old inventories. But instead, I found codes. Dozens of them. Page after page of neatly handwritten entries with no clear pattern. Names reduced to initials. Dollar signs, percentages, timestamps, but nothing to ground it. One column simply read C, followed by numbers that felt more like case references than accounting. The pages hummed with something more than money. They felt dangerous. I took the ledger upstairs to the apartment Evelyn had lived in above the store. The place was frozen in time. Lace curtains, stiff armchairs, a tea set left to dry on the rack. Her room smelled faintly of lavender and old paperbacks. On the nightstand, I found a half-burned candle, a notebook filled with quotes in Evelyn's script, and an old photograph of the two of us, me at 12, arms wrapped around her waist, both of us laughing. It felt like she was watching. Back downstairs, the bell above the shop door rang. A woman in her 60s stood there in a navy wool coat, hair pinned too neatly to be casual. Her eyes scanned the store like she already knew what she'd find. "You must be Elena," she said. I nodded. "Can I help you?" She didn't smile. "I'm Margot Penrose. I used to work with your godmother. I heard you've taken over." "Just for 6 months," I said, unsure why I was defending it. She stepped inside. 6 months is longer than most last. There was a sharpness to her that wasn't quite threat, but not far. Her gaze lingered on the back wall, where the framed quote hung crooked. "She kept records, you know," Margot added, almost idly. "Things people thought had disappeared." "What kind of records?" "Depends on who's asking." And with that, she turned and left. I didn't move for a while, because something in her voice, and in Evelyn's strange ledger, had cracked the story wide open. This bookstore wasn't a business. It was a vault. And I had just inherited the key. The first threat wasn't obvious. It came as a note, folded once, slipped through the door after sunset. The paper was cream-colored, heavier than standard, the kind used for wedding invitations or lawsuits. "No envelope, no greeting." Just 7 words, written in narrow, deliberate strokes. "Leave before she gets you hurt, too." I read it once, then again, and finally left it on the counter beside the register like a challenge. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was brave, but because something told me Evelyn wouldn't have. This wasn't the new fight. It was one she'd left unfinished. That night, I couldn't sleep. The upstairs apartment groaned with the wind, and the walls held a chill deeper than the season. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the floorboards creak downstairs. Not in the natural way old buildings shift, but like movement. Footsteps. Deliberate. Slow. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone in one hand, Evelyn's old brass-handled flashlight in the other, and crept down the back staircase barefoot. The shop was dark. Still. But the rear door, the one that should have been bolted, hung open 2 inches. I swung it wide. Nothing but fog, and the faint glow of the lamplight out front. But at the base of the doorframe, I found a smear of wet boot print leading inside, and then abruptly ending. Whoever it was, they knew the layout. They weren't searching. They were sending a message. By dawn, I'd installed new locks. I pushed a tall bookcase in front of the rear entrance. It wasn't fear exactly, it was calculation. A line had been crossed. Whoever Evelyn had kept at bay while alive now believed her silence died with her. But I had the ledger, and I was starting to understand what it really was. Each entry was a marker. Hush money, blackmail, or protection. I found names connected to dates that matched major events in the town's past. Scandals I vaguely remembered from local news stories Evelyn used to read aloud over tea. A land dispute that disappeared from the courts. A financial audit that led nowhere. A factory fire ruled accidental despite years of rumors. The initials repeated. RPMB. Jak wyżej. The town was a web. And Evelyn had been the spider, half archivist, half avenger. I copied the ledger page by page, storing digital backups in cloud folders no one would guess. I didn't know what I'd do with the information. Not yet. But I knew I needed it. Because Evelyn hadn't just left me property. She'd left me leverage. And the people who had feared her while she was alive, They were starting to realize something she must have known all along, that grief, when sharpened by purpose, becomes a weapon. By the end of my 4th week in West Haven, the town no longer tried to pretend it welcomed me. People no longer smiled when they passed the shop. Some didn't speak to me at all, just stared a little too long from behind their windows, as if I were a walking reminder of something they hoped was buried with Evelyn. But I didn't retreat. I cleaned the windows. I restocked the shelves. I opened the doors every day at 9 a.m., even when no one walked in. That was Evelyn's final move. She didn't ask me to sell the store or visit the property. She made me stay. Made me sit in the shadow of whatever truth she'd tried to protect until I was willing to face it head on. And that moment came with a reading. Evelyn's final manuscript had been buried in a false drawer beneath the children's section. I found it by accident, or fate, when I knocked over a wooden stool and watched the baseboard crack open. Inside, a leather-bound folder, brittle at the edges, filled with handwritten pages in Evelyn's script. She'd titled it simply, "The Things They Buried." It wasn't fiction. It was testimony. Dozens of entries, each one more damning than the last. Corruption, extortion, arson, cover-ups, names attached, initials confirmed by matching ledger entries, stories laid bare with a precision that felt clinical. She hadn't written a book. She'd built a confession. Not hers, theirs. I read every page. Twice. Then I sent out flyers. A reading at Seaworn Books, the night before the annual West Haven Town Hall, a tradition where locals gathered to discuss budgets, permits, and coastal erosion over stale coffee and silent judgments. It was an unspoken ritual. I added a handwritten line to each flyer. A final chapter Evelyn wanted read aloud. They came. The store filled slowly, uneasily, as if the floor might cave in. Familiar faces stood in corners. Margot Penrose arrived last, her lips set in a firm line. I stood at the front counter with a single spotlight overhead and Evelyn's folder open before me. I didn't smile. I read. The first story was about the Whitaker fire, the one that claimed a child and closed the factory. Evelyn had found the missing inspection reports. She'd recorded a conversation with the town fire chief admitting he'd been paid to alter the file. The initials in the ledger? GW. A silence followed that was heavier than any applause. I continued. A land scheme that robbed families of their property. A business loan program that funneled funds to fake shell companies. All backed by names who still held office, still ran banks, still sent me passive-aggressive glares across the farmer's market. With each paragraph, the room shifted, from defiant stillness to wide-eyed recognition. Then I closed the folder. I'm not here to punish anyone, I said. But this bookstore won't stay silent. Neither will I. And I left them there, with their guilt, their fear, and the sound of Evelyn's voice echoing through mine. The morning after the reading, no one came into the shop. No whispers. No confrontations. No apologies. Just a tense, loaded quiet that blanketed the town like a low fog. I opened Seaworn Books at 9 a.m., as I always did. Made tea. Lit the candle Evelyn left on the counter. And waited. By noon, I received my first letter, and signed, sealed in a plain envelope, slipped under the door. Inside were copies of 2 permits for a land deal Evelyn had referenced in her ledger. Attached was a note. You were right. This was wrong. It was the first of many. Some came with documents, some with money, some with nothing but the weight of confession. They didn't want to say it out loud, but they knew. And while some chose silence, others began to speak. The local newspaper ran an anonymous op-ed about the fire. An alderman quietly resigned before the town hall. A new committee formed to re-examine building permits for waterfront development. None of them said Evelyn's name. But her shadow stretched long. By October, People began coming back into the shop. First for books, then for conversation. A young woman who had once turned her back at the farmer's market asked if we carried poetry. A man in his 60s asked if I could help him find a rare memoir about whistleblowers. Even Margot Penrose returned, twice. The second time, she brought a box of old photographs and left it on the counter. She kept more than secrets, she said. She kept people. I nodded. That was the part one hadn't expected, that beneath all the quiet wars Evelyn had waged, she'd also built a sanctuary. A place where truth didn't just survive, it was archived, protected, shelved like sacred text. When the 6 months passed, I received a letter from the estate lawyer confirming the condition had been fulfilled. The property, the business, the apartment above, it was all mine. I didn't hesitate. I stayed. Not out of obligation, not even out of loyalty, but because the store, the stories, and the secrets had become mine too. I wasn't just the custodian of a bookstore. I was the keeper of memory, of warning, of legacy. Evelyn didn't raise me to be fearless. She raised me to be ready. And now, when people pass by Seaworn Books, they do so knowing exactly what it is. Not just a quiet little store by the ocean, but a place where the truth has a shelf of its own. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever uncovered family secrets or held power you didn't ask for, like this video, subscribe to the channel and stay for more stories where the quiet ones turn out to be the most dangerous.